For the past 3 months, I have been working on a piece for solo piano entitled Solitudes. The piece is in 2 movements, with each inspired by works by 20th century composers that I deeply admire, John Adams and George Crumb. As a composer, I am of course influenced by the music I listen to, but this was my first attempt at writing something specifically in the style of another composer. I think it's a useful exercise for composers to develop their own voice to try to write like someone else, and it proved an interesting and rewarding challenge. When I began the project in January, I planned on professionally recording it with the help of 2 wonderful colleagues at the University of Arizona and close friends, pianist Bryce Kimball and audio engineer / fellow composer Daniela Bolin, so that by the end of this project I would have a new piece of music written and a polished recording of it. Unfortunately, like everyone else in the world, plans I made in January of 2020 were very different come March. But the silver lining is that halfway into the project, I realized that my timeline was too ambitious, and I likely would not have been able to finish a piece I was happy with, have a performer learn it, and get a recording by April. Instead, my goal became publication. I frequently look for competitions, calls for scores, and publication opportunities, and I found that Tux People's Music Publishing is holding an open call for submissions. Coincidentally, the deadline is April 30th, which is only 2 days after my deadline for this project. I've been self-publishing through my website, and while I think it's a useful thing to do, as it allows me to keep 100% of profits instead of as low as 10%, being published through a company is a great way to establish oneself as a serious composer. So, in addition to 2 other pieces, my contest piece for clarinet and piano, and 5 miniatures for chamber orchestra, I decided to make it my goal to finish Solitudes before this deadline and add 1 more piece to my list of submissions. The first movement, Andromeda Fragments, began with a 6-note gesture. In an almost programmatic sense, I conceived of each note as a sort of star and each gesture as a constellation. The next step after coming up with the basic idea was to figure out sketches for ways to develop the material and structure the rest of the movement. Throughout the piece, these gestures get closer together until it is one continuous stream of notes, which further develops into a climactic section of clusters and incessant rhythmic banging which calms down into a series of arpeggios that bring us back to that initial gesture. I decided to notate both movements without bar lines or time signatures. In the case of Andromeda Fragments, there needed to be a sense of space in the first section and an uninterrupted flow in the rest of the movement. I was primarily looking at John Adams' Hallelujah Junction and Phrygian gates for inspiration, 2 minimalist pieces which work with repetitions of the same gesture for long periods of time. I think I was successful in capturing Adams' compositional techniques, albeit in a considerably truncated way, and marrying it with my own musical voice in terms of harmonic and melodic content. However, my style isn't as far from John Adams as it is from George Crumb, so this wasn't the movement that I was worried about. If the first movement looked above to the vast solitudes of space, the second, Seafarer, looks below, beneath the surface of the ocean. I have a fascination, or perhaps obsession, with the deep sea and its darkness, isolation, and beauty. I looked no further than George Crumb for inspiration, specifically this work which I dare not try to pronounce in Latin, but which translates to The Voice of the Whale. This has been a seminal work in my development as a composer, as it opened my eyes to the world of extended techniques, especially for piano. In composing the movement, I used a combination of plucked strings, fingers run over the strings, and traditional playing to create a pictorial effect. For the pitch material, I primarily used the pentatonic scale for its harmonic freedom and openness. Its absence of half steps blurs any sense of a tonal center, and by using it, I was able to create a sense of stagnance and freedom. The biggest challenge I faced in the composition of this work came in the form of notation. I wanted to notate it without bar lines to preserve the sense of blurred beats, and in doing so, there were many times where I had to creatively figure out ways to notate somewhat abstract gestures in ways that are clear and concise to the performer. Especially in the second movement, I probably spent more time notating it than I did actually coming up with the material. Another challenge was that by the time I got to the composition process of the second movement, I no longer had access to a grand piano. I had planned on workshopping the extended techniques with Bryce so I would have a better idea of what the second movement would sound like. Without that, I had to write purely based on what I believed the effect of the extended techniques would be. It proved a considerable challenge, and I had 2 or 3 drafts that I completely scrapped before finally settling on what I wanted it to be. It took these multiple drafts to realize that what I had created was not coherent phrases or gestures, but just a collection of different techniques thrown on the page. So in my final draft, I had to structure each phrase on a micro level to fit into the larger picture. I'm happy to say that I think I succeeded, and the final product is true to what I set out to do. However, I encountered one final issue at the tail end of the project. To submit the piece for publication, I still needed a recording. The MIDI mockup worked just fine for the first movement, but the second movement was a different story. MIDI can't express the abstract nature of the notation or the extended techniques, so there was no hope of an artificial rendering, and I couldn't do it on my electronic keyboard because there are no strings to pluck. I needed the real thing. And luckily, at the last second, I found a volunteer. My good friend and fellow composer Matthew Lanning was gracious enough to learn and record the piece in a very short time frame. I learned a lot from doing this project. For instance, things don't always go according to plan, and sometimes global pandemics get in the way of your projects. But I learned how to overcome the problems this created, and that there's always a way to make it work. For a period of time, I was convinced the second movement was never going to happen, and that if it did, it wouldn't be something I was at all proud of. But I put in the hours to learn the logistics of writing the extended techniques I didn't know how to do, and I made it work. And even if it's not exactly what I thought the piece would be when I first started writing it, I feel like I accomplished something new in my career, and that going forward I have a compositional tool to add to my palette that I didn't have before. And it's something I've learned and relearned time and again, but collaboration is perhaps the most important tool we have as musicians. Even when physically separated, I am so grateful to have colleagues who are willing to put in the time and effort to bring the music I've written to life. Speaking of, enjoy Matthew Lanning's performance of Seafarer, and thank you for watching this video.